additions to it. I think the American people expect us at the very least, and I encourage my fellow senators to vote for my resolution. Thank you, and I yield back the remainder of my time and suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
So the Senate really kind of winding down the clock or running out the clock as they move towards a 1 a.m. vote, procedure requiring them to wait till 1 a.m. this morning to vote, or tomorrow morning really, to vote on that continuing resolution that would fund the government for 6 more months, the new budget year starting October 1st. The House passed a measure, you may recall, a couple of weeks ago that would continue current spending for a half year. Most agencies in the government would get an increase of about 0.5%, and we'll continue our live coverage of the Senate as the day progresses. The Associated Press this afternoon reporting that Mitt Romney is releasing his 2011 tax returns. Here's how the AP reported the story. It says that Romney aides on Friday said the Republican presidential nominee would give the public a look at his finished tax forms. Ahead of their release, expected at 3 o'clock this afternoon, aides said Mr. Romney earned almost $13.7 million last year and paid more than $1.9 million in taxes, an effective tax rate of 14.1%. Romney's campaign earlier estimated that Mr. Romney would pay about $3.2 million in taxes. The AP goes on to say that Mr. Romney paid about $3 million in federal income taxes in 2010, or 13.9%. Critics, including President Barack Obama, have urged Mr. Romney to release more than just the 2 years of returns and follow his father's model. When George Romney ran for president, he released 12 years of tax returns. That from the Associated Press. And as we wait for senators to return to the floor, we'll show you a segment of this morning's Washington Journal with Democrat Jim McDermott from Washington State talking about spending.
As Congress wraps up business today, we want to check in with Congressman Jim McDermott, Democrat from Washington, a member of the House Ways and Means Committee. Thanks very much for being with us here on C-SPAN.
It's my pleasure.
A couple of issues we want to talk with you about. First and foremost, as a doctor yourself, one of the stories that got our attention from the New York Times this past week is a report from the American Association of Medical Colleges estimating that by 2015, the country will have 62,900 fewer doctors than are needed. That's just a couple of years away.
Yes, it is.
What's the reason?
It's a huge problem. Well, a couple of things. You've got retirements. Obviously, people get old and they say, I'm not going to practice medicine anymore. It's harder and harder for kids to go to medical school, and we simply have not expanded our classes in medical school to deal with the expanding population in the United States. So there are a number of factors which explain what's happening, but the reason we are really in a problem is that we're shortly going to implement a bill where we take 30 million people who have not had health care before and bring them in and give them access to the system. And it's estimated by 2020 that we're going to be short 45,000 primary care doctors. So we've got a number of very near-term problems that we've got to start dealing with.
And not only that, primary care physicians over the next 10 to 15 years, and overall about 100,000 fewer doctors than are needed. And so people are looking at the president's health care law, it's called Obamacare, as one of the reasons. Was that taken into account fully when you and other Democrats implemented this law?
Yes. When we went down to the White House before this all started, I told him of the program that I'm proposing, because I said you're going to need a lot of primary care doctors. What the problem in Massachusetts was they took everybody in, and then people went around saying, well, where do I find a doctor? Because doctors aren't taking any more patients because they're full. So it was clear from the Massachusetts experience that the same thing was going to go on nationally. We put some provisions in to expand the National Health Service Corps and some programs that have been there before, but in my view they were just they were too small, too little, too late, really, because we're going to have a major problem here in 10 years.
If you take a college student who is thinking about medical school, it's going to take him or her at least 8 to 10 years to go through medical school, to do the internships and the training. So you're still talking about an 8 to 10 year proposition to make them a full-fledged physician.
When I started medical school, I spent 4 years in medical school, then I did a year of internship, and then I took my residency in child psychiatry. So I was there 9 years after.
If the senator would please ask for the quorum call to be rescinded.
I ask unanimous consent the quorum call be suspended. I be allowed to address the Senate as this morning business in a colloquy with the senator from South Carolina and perhaps other senators who may wish to speak.
Without objection.
Let's see,
Mr. President, before I get into the issue concerning the Senator from Kentucky's amendment, I was just informed that the President of the United States, while speaking to Hispanic television, alleged that the reason why immigration reform was not enacted in the last 4 years of his presidency is because the senator from Arizona walked away. Incredible. An incredible statement. I'm not often in the business of accusing presidents of the United States of not telling the truth. But facts are stubborn things. First of all, it was then Senator Obama who joined with Senator Kennedy and me when we were doing comprehensive immigration reform, and we pledged that we would take tough votes so that the whole fragile coalition would not fall apart. Instead of doing that, the senator from Illinois, Barack Obama, proposed an amendment which would have destroyed the entire coalition we had together, and did so without telling Senator Kennedy or me or anyone else, by sunsetting the provisions that called for temporary workers. But more importantly, in 2009, I was invited over to the White House. I came over there. There was a conversation with others about comprehensive immigration reform, and the President at that time stated they would be proposing legislation. I told him I'd be glad to examine it, and I'd be glad to support any effort at comprehensive immigration reform that I could agree with. Nothing came from the White House. Zero. Not one word. Not one piece of legislation was proposed by the administration. After the shooting and the tragedy in Tucson, the President gave a great speech. I wrote an article thanking him. I was invited over to the White House again. And when we discussed comprehensive immigration reform, I said, I'm ready to sit down with you and move forward on it. He said, of course. There was never a word. Was the President of the United States waiting for the senator from Arizona to bring forward comprehensive immigration reform? Is that how he thinks government works? So, again, we find a president who wants to blame everybody else, no matter what it is. My friend from South Carolina was involved in this issue as well, and I'd be interested in his observation of this entire issue. I still stand ready to move forward with comprehensive immigration reform.
Yeah, thank you. It was very difficult politics. It was a very fragile but robust coalition back in the day. President Bush sent over 2 cabinet secretaries every week, was personally involved in trying to get comprehensive immigration reform passed in 2006 and 2007. I saw firsthand the commitment by the White House where Secretary Guterres and many others came over. Homeland Security Secretary came over and basically wrote the bill line by line. Senator Kennedy, myself, McCain, Kyle, just a bunch of people, Salazar. Senator Obama showed up on occasion. But at the end of the day, the basic construct was that for a modern immigration system, merit-based immigration, a new way of doing business, better border security, better employer verification systems, Republicans would allow the 12 million to earn their way into lawful standing, a long and arduous pathway to citizenship they would have to earn, and in return we would get a temporary worker program that would help American businesses supplement the labor force when they could not find an American worker after paying a competitive wage. The Chamber, all businesses were for this because it gave the business community the certainty they needed regarding immigration. And part of the grand bargain was that the Chamber would be able to access labor in a more modern, efficient way. The labor unions hated that part of the bill. A lot of people on the right hated the idea of earned pathway to citizenship, coming out of the shadows and living under the law, paying taxes and all the other things in the bill. And Senator Obama, out of nowhere, came to the floor and said, I have a common sense amendment. I'd like to propose that we sunset the temporary worker program, 400,000 I think it was allocated to American businesses, after 5 years. Well, what would have happened if I came to the floor and said, let's terminate the pathway to citizenship or sunset it after 5 years? That was the heart and soul of the deal. Thank God his amendment went down. But during the negotiations and during that critical time, I think he gave in to the pressure from the unions. But he did promise in 2008 when he ran against Senator McCain that he would pass comprehensive immigration reform in his first year. And I looked at the interview last night and got bits and pieces of it. As I recall the first year of the Obama administration, it was all about Obamacare and the stimulus. I don't remember any effort, bipartisan or otherwise, to deal with comprehensive immigration reform because all the political capital was spent on Obamacare and the stimulus. And at the end of the day, the only time President Obama has talked about immigration reform was when rallies were going to be held, and here at the late hour of the election, he tries to do something with a DREAM Act modified in a unilateral fashion. So at the end of the day, you're right, Senator McCain. You can blame others, but I think the record speaks pretty loudly and clearly where his agenda laid in the first couple of years of his administration, and immigration reform was not even a blip on the radar screen.
Mr. President, again, on another subject, yesterday the Senate and then later the House were called together to get a briefing from key members of the administration, led by the Secretary of State, high-ranking member of the FBI, our Director of National Intelligence, General Clapper, and the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to tell us ostensibly what happened in the tragic death of Ambassador Christopher Stevens and 3 other brave Americans. So we gathered down in the secret room, which everybody turns in their phones and BlackBerries, and we went in and listened to basically a description of America's military disposition in that part of the world, something which certainly does not warrant a super-secret briefing. But more importantly than that, when the Secretary and the others were asked exactly what happened here, what caused this tragedy, what was the sequence of events. In fact, it was the senator who's the ranking member of the Intelligence Committee. What happened? The answer was, well, that's still an ongoing investigation, and we can't tell you anything. Now, we were supposed to be down there to hear what happened, to hear the administration's version of events of what happened. We were told nothing. We were told absolutely nothing because it's an investigation going on. Mr. President, this morning, the Wall Street Journal, entitled, "Misjudgments Preceded Deadly Libya Attack," there is a tick-tock starting at 8 p.m. all the way through of the events that took place. Now, if that isn't an incredible disrespect to the members of the United States Senate, I don't know what is. So, again, it's an example of the disdain with which this body is held by the administration, including, I'm sorry to say, the Secretary of State. So it's not that I am offended as a United States Senator. It is that the disrespect to the institution of the Senate, when we're called together ostensibly to receive information, that information they tell us they can't give us, and then it appears on the front page of the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. What does that mean about the attitude that this administration has to this body? Obviously, it's not one that I think is of respect. So, you want to?
Well, just briefly, I was very disappointed in the briefing yesterday, too. The bottom line is we asked questions like how many security people were at the Benghazi consulate. We'll have to get back with. Then you pick up the New York Times and you get a blow-by-blow description of what supposedly went on. So it was very frustrating. It's like pulling teeth to get information yesterday. A lot of senators were frustrated. and you pick up major papers in the country and you find details not shared with you. And one of the things I'm worried about is we're trying to find out who committed these terrible acts of terrorism, and they were acts of terrorism, not a spontaneous riot. I said, what is the game plan? Will they be held as enemy combatants? Are they going to be held as common criminals? Will they be prosecuted in Libya? Will they be brought back to the United States? Do you have to read them their Miranda rights? Really, absolutely not a whole lot of information. But at the end of the day, it was a lost opportunity, I think, to inform the Congress. Can we now move to the Rand Paul amendment?
Mr. President, I'd like to take what remaining time we have in order to discuss the Paul amendment. And I'd like to begin by asking insertion in the congressional record a letter from retired military leaders urge opposition to Paul amendment.
Without objection.
Mr. President, you know, I don't think that our military leaders, retired and active duty, are infallible, but I think their views are very important, given the vast experience that so many of them on this list. This is 110 retired 3- and 4-star generals and admirals. I think we should at least pay close attention to their views. They've earned it. They have earned our respect for their views. And the letter, again, signed by 110 retired 3- and 4-star generals and admirals, states, and I quote, as co-chairs of the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition's National Security Advisory Council, a group of more than 110 retired 3- and 4-star generals and admirals, we believe that the international affairs budget, i.e. U.S. foreign assistance, is critical to America's national security. Like all Americans, we are concerned about the recent events that have taken place in Cairo, Benghazi, and other parts of the Arab world. However, a wholesale suspension of U.S. assistance to nations in this region is not in America's national security interests. U.S. assistance is not a gift to recipient nations. It is not a tool to make other countries like us. It's a critical component, along with a robust military, of America's national security strategy. These programs pay dividends in terms of our national security and preventing another 9/11. America must remain strongly engaged in the world. We urge opposition to the amendment offered by Senator Rand Paul to suspend U.S. assistance to several nations in the most volatile regions of the world. Thank you for your consideration of our views. And then 110 former 3-star and 4-star admirals and generals. In addition to that, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that a letter from AIPAC be inserted in the record.
Without objection.
This letter is from the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, America's pro-Israel lobby. It is a letter addressed to Majority Leader Harry Reid and Minority Leader Mitch McConnell. We are writing to express our opposition to the Paul Amendment cutting off U.S. foreign assistance to countries which host a U.S. diplomatic facility that is attacked any time after September 1, 2012. While we hope every effort is made to find and prosecute the terrorists who murdered the brave U.S. diplomats killed in the embassy attacks in Benghazi, Libya, we do not believe the approach outlined in the Paul Amendment is the way to respond to these horrific acts. For one, the amendment is broadly drafted so it would potentially affect aid to an American ally, including Israel, should terrorists decide to, quote, attack, trespass, or breach U.S. diplomatic facilities there. Furthermore, at this time of turmoil and uncertainty in the Middle East, the United States government needs to be able to use all available tools to influence events in the region. U.S. foreign assistance programs are a critical part of that toolbox and essential to ensuring continued strong American leadership in the world. We urge you to oppose the Paul Amendment. Now, all of us here are very familiar with AIPAC. It is a very, very well-respected and highly regarded organization that is really responsible for informing us, for strengthening our ties between the United States and Israel. And I hope that my colleagues will take this very strong letter of AIPAC into consideration. Now, there's so many things wrong with the Rand Amendment that it's hard to know where to begin. I'd like to mention, because I know my colleague who plays a role on the Appropriations Committee and the ranking member of the Intelligence Committee want to join in, and I don't want to take too much time. I want to mention two countries, Libya to start with. Now, somehow, to labor under the belief that the Libyan people are opponents of the United States of America is a fundamental misunderstanding of the Libyans and the Libyan people. They are grateful. They are grateful to the United States of America. They have condemned this attack and this heinous crime of the assassination of 4 brave Americans. They have said they will do everything in their power to bring these people to justice. I was there on July 7th in Tripoli, and I saw thousands of Libyans saying, "Thank you, America. Thank you, United States. Thank you, Ambassador Stevens. Thank you." Because they were under the yoke of one of the most brutal dictators on earth, who, by the way, was responsible for the deaths of Americans in Pan Am 103 and the bombing of a disco in Berlin. So, but there's a problem in this country. They have porous borders. They have militias running around. They have not had a government of their own forever, literally. And they need our help. They need our help in providing border security, in bringing these militias under control and these weapons that are proliferated everywhere. So our message with the Paul Amendment is adios. See you around. That's not America's role in Libya. That's not America's role in the world. And nothing would be more welcomed in Libya today than if the Islamists and al-Qaeda, who are there, and other extremists that nothing would make them happier than to hear that the United States had cut off all assistance to Libya. Nothing would encourage them more. Nothing would allow them to gain more traction and support from the Libyan people. This is a fight for the heart and souls of the people of the Middle East. It's not a video. It's not a video that has caused this problem and these riots and demonstrations. It's the efforts of the Islamists who magnify and spread an obscure video throughout the Arab world to stoke up the fears and anger of the people of these countries, when the fact is that it is a struggle for power. That's what's going on with these videos, is a struggle for power. So we're going to send a message to the Libyan people who lost thousands of their citizens in this recent struggle to oust Gaddafi from their country. The second country I just want to mention very quickly is Egypt. Many of us are disappointed at some of the actions the Egyptians have taken. I will say that President Morsi condemned these attacks. He went to Tehran and condemned Bashar Assad. But Egypt, in my view, is pretty much kind of up for grabs. I don't know how the Egyptians are going to go. There's a struggle internally between the Salafists and the extremists and those who want a modern and a democratic society. And that struggle will continue on. But I'd also remind my colleagues that one of the signal agreements of our time was the Egyptian-Israeli peace agreement, which was consummated at Camp David by President Carter, Anwar Sadat, and Menachem Begin. And this was a major step forward, peace between Egypt and Israel. Part of that deal was that the United States would provide aid to Egypt. How are the Egyptians going to react if we cut off aid to them? I can tell you how they'll react. They'll react that we have breached an agreement that's gone on for a long time. And believe me, Egypt and Israel's relations are vital in the Middle East. And again, what would prove a better message to the extremists than be able to tell our people, not only does the American people dislike us, not only are they not in support of us, but they won't assist us and other countries. There are many other examples, and I believe that the United States' role in the world is important, and I believe also, as I mentioned as a footnote, this debate's been going on all of the 20th century, now into the 21st century. Those who are isolationists want to withdraw to Fortress America. You could go back to post-World War I and the fight over the League of Nations, and prior to World War II, the isolationists, the Henry Fords, the Charles Lindberghs, the isolationists prior to World War II, past World War II, the Taft wing of the Republican Party and the Eisenhower wing, all the way up to this fight that will probably continue. History will show that the greatest nation in history was the United States of America, who following World War II restored Europe, turned back the tide of communism, has been able all over the world with no greed, no selfish interest except for democracy and freedom to aid these countries, which eventually redounds to the favor of the United States of America. I urge, obviously, rejection of the Rand Amendment.
Mr. President.
The Senator from South Carolina.
I do see Senator Chambliss here. I'll ask him a question here and get his thoughts. But just to kind of follow on what Senator McCain was saying, it's the Rand Paul Amendment, yeah. And to begin with, Rand Paul is a recently elected senator who's come to the body with a lot of enthusiasm, and he is willing to make hard choices. I've worked with him on Medicare reform, on Social Security reform. I think he will take on the spending situation in this country very aggressively. I think he's very brave when it comes to entitlement reform. On that side of the ledger, I find myself very much in agreement with what he wants to do. But he does have a view of foreign policy that I think is ill-suited to the times and historically has not worn very well. As Senator McCain said, history's full of moments where America and other powers felt like now's the time to withdraw and let those people argue among themselves. The problem with letting those people, and you just fill in the blank who they might be, argue among themselves, ignores the fact that what goes on in one place in the world can affect us, and no better example than 9/11. The entire operation to attack our nation cost less than $1 million. The 2021 terrorists who trained to attack us had about $1 million budget. The author of this attack lived in a cave in a faraway place called Afghanistan. So it really does matter what happens in places like Afghanistan. And radical Islamists have no desire for democracy in the Mideast or anywhere else, and they're a force within the Mideast and throughout the world. But the good news for us is that they're a minority force. The Taliban, who's a cousin of al-Qaeda basically, are very much rejected by the Afghan people. When you go to Kabul today, you see a city with electricity, with commerce, with cars, with movement, with women in school, and the average Afghan doesn't want to go back to the Taliban way of doing business, where there's no music, there's no interaction with each other, only on terms that they set for you. And so what you see on your television at night is a political struggle for the heart and soul of the Mideast. This has been going on for a long time, and finally the lid blew. Egypt was an authoritarian, corrupt dictatorship. Tunisia, Libya was ruled by Gaddafi, Syria by Assad. And what you see is people who have seen another way of living are saying, enough already. I'm not going to be part of that anymore. I'm going to try to change my life and my children's life. And within that population, you also have people who are dead set on making sure that that nation in the Islamic world goes backward, not forward. And we have to take sides. And if we don't take sides and we sit on the sidelines, we'll pay a price. I think it is better to help people fight the Taliban than it is to ignore the Taliban. I think it's good to go after al-Qaeda in every country on the planet so they never know a moment of peace, so we can have a few moments of peace. I think it's better to fight these guys in their backyard than to come home and let them come back to our backyard. There's a reason we haven't been attacked in over 11 years. We've been on the offense, and there's more ways to be on the offense than just bombing people. The biggest fear of the Taliban and al-Qaeda, beyond having a bomb dropped on their head, and they don't mind dying. They really don't like living. They will die in a heartbeat to make sure you can't live your life the way you would like. It is absolutely of no consequence to them to sacrifice their own life and take you with them, and their goal is, if we're going to live, you're going to live my way, not your way. Their big fear is that people have the capacity to say no to them and the ability to fight back and win in the countries in question. So when you kill bin Laden, that's a moment of satisfaction and justice. But has that changed the war on terror? Have the terrorists given up? Have people said, oh, the Americans killed bin Laden, we better not go over the wall in Egypt, we better not attack the consulate? No. This is a struggle between the modern world and forces of darkness, and the way America wins this war is to empower those in other countries to fight and win in their own country without us having to be there with 100,000 troops all the time. And the biggest nightmare of the Taliban and al-Qaeda is to build a one-room schoolhouse where kids can get an education, to have clean drinking water that you own and control, to be able to go to a courtroom rather than a Sharia court to have resolutions resolved, to be able to have commerce and interaction with the rest of the world, to trade with the rest of the world. That's what they fear most. And our foreign assistance budget, foreign aid, is 1% of the entire federal budget. And if you took it off the table, you're left with the following way to affect the world: do nothing or bomb people. And you know what? Those men and women in uniform have been at war for 11 years. How about having a tool in America's toolbox to fight the enemy without having to use military force? When you clear a village of the Taliban, how do you hold and build that village? You bring in a health care clinic, something at the most rudimentary standards, something that you would not even think about sending your kids to, but they welcome it because they've never had anything. Basic one-room schoolhouse with a chalkboard and a few books lights up people's lives like you would not believe. That's how you hold and build. And to the State Department, the Department of Agriculture, who are teaching people to plant crops other than heroin. That's the al-Qaeda Taliban's worst nightmare. And Egypt and Libya and Pakistan and Yemen, and you fill in the blank, Afghanistan. Now here's where I'm going to challenge my friend Rand Paul's judgment, quite frankly. He has offered an amendment at one of the most critical times in the history of the Mideast that would sever all aid, all assistance to Libya, Egypt, and Pakistan. Why are we so upset by this thought process? Trust me, I know we're broke. $16 trillion in debt. America is struggling like any other time in my adult life, and we've got to get our fiscal house in order. But how do you live in peace and prosperity with the rest of the world in flames? And if you want to pay $10 a gallon for gas, turn the Mideast over to these crazy nut jobs. So, here's my view of what we should do. We should stay in this fight, and we should do more things than just bomb people. We should help them help themselves. And the good news is most people appreciate our help, and what you see on TV is a result not of a film, but of radical Islamists taking advantage of a moment. The cultures are different. It's hard for people in the Mideast to understand that a film could be made disrespecting Islam without the government approving of it, because in their world, nothing gets done without the government approving of it. So it's important for us to say this has nothing to do with the United States government or the American people. This is a result of some crazy group of people who have what we call freedom of speech. It's uncomfortable, but that's the way we are. So I think it is important to let the Mideast know, and Muslims in general, that that's the way we operate. We reject the disrespect shown to anyone's religion, and that is not who we are as a people. But freedom of speech does exist here, and the reason we need to explain that is because in their world, they can't imagine something being done like this without the government blessing it. But having said that, there is no excuse in any society to do harm to another human being because of the way somebody speaks or acts, unless it's an act of violence. So, Senator Paul is proposing disengagement in 3 of the most volatile areas of the Mideast at a time when it means the most. And the way he's written this amendment should make everyone pause and evaluate how you want to vote. AIPAC, which most of us are familiar with, has indicated that the way the amendment is written, if there's an act of violence against a U.S. interest in Israel, maybe we would have to withdraw our aid to Israel. But they have said they oppose the Rand Paul amendment because they know what happens to Egypt if this thing must to pass, if it were ever to become law. The treaty that Senator McCain referred to was the Camp David Accords. Israel and Egypt have been living under a peace treaty for decades now, and part of the deal was that America would provide aid to Egypt and Israel. If we broke the agreement with Egypt, they will break the treaty with Israel. So do not tell me or anybody else that you support Israel if you vote for this amendment, because one of 2 things are going on. You have no idea what it means to support Israel, or you're trying to pull the wool over my eyes. It is impossible to say you support the security of the Israeli nation if you vote for this amendment, because it will lead to the breach of a treaty with one of their strongest neighbors, 80 million people living in Egypt. It will unravel a delicate balance that existed for decades, and I will be recorded as having no part of that. Imagine if this amendment passed. What would the chatter be on every Islamic website in the world? And by the way, if these people had a PAC, they would be supporting this amendment. I know that Rand Paul is as patriotic as anybody in this body, but the fact of the matter is the crazy Islamic extremists, terrorists who try to kill us all would love nothing more than this to pass. They know they cannot win if we stay engaged helping people. So they're trying to drive us out because that's their best hope of winning the day. So, if you want to empower the terrorists that exist in this world, pass this amendment, because they will go crazy with hope and excitement about their tactics are working. And if you want to destroy the hope of everybody in the Mideast who has been brave enough to stand up to these thugs and lose their family members, if you want to break their spirit, pass this amendment. If this amendment passes, good luck finding anybody anywhere in the world who will partner with us, who would be brave enough to stand up to these thugs and say, you will not have my children's future. If this amendment passed, America could never look anyone in the eye again in the Mideast and say, stand with me. You can count on me. So, ladies and gentlemen of the United States and my colleagues in the Senate, I wish the world were not as screwed up as it is. I wish it would change, and I hate the fact we've been at war and we spent so much money. But I'm telling you this right now. These are historic times in which we live in, And every time in history that good people were confronted with evil and they blinked, millions died, not thousands. And the only reason millions haven't died in the war on terror is the nut jobs who want to kill us all can't get a hold of the weapons to do it. And if you want Iran to not get a nuclear weapon, if that bothers you that they may get a nuclear weapon and throw the whole region into a nuclear arms race or share that technology with a terrorist organization to use it against us, then vote against this amendment, because if this passed, what would the Iranians think about America's resolve to deal with them? And the last thing I'm going to talk about is the vision of the author of this amendment, who, honest to goodness, is a friend, but on this issue, I think he's dead wrong. In his budget, and he had the guts to write a budget, and I give him credit for that, but you need to look at the vision of the author of this amendment when it comes to our role in the world. In his budget, the American military's budget was reduced by 16% in the first year. And this foreign assistance account that I was talking about, which gives us a tool other than killing people, staying engaged and trying to build up their lives so they can live in peace with us, it's about $50 billion, about 1% of the budget. Under his proposal, it goes down to $5 billion after 2014 and frozen there forever. So I want to let you know that the author of this amendment believes that you can gut the military, and that's exactly what he does with military spending. Take all the assets we have to help people off the table and we'll be safe. Now, how in the world could somebody believe that, given the times in which we live in, it's a good idea to take military spending below historic levels and disengage from the world and have absolutely no influence on nations other than trying to use military force? So I hope my colleagues will come to the floor and resist the temptation to do something that sounds good in a 30-second soundbite. I know people are frustrated and war-weary, and I know we're broke, and you'd like to just leave everybody else alone, but they're not going to leave you alone. And look how much money we spent after 9/11. Look what 20 people can do to this nation if we disengage from the world. So now I would like to ask a question of my colleague, Senator Chambliss, who's the ranking member of the Intelligence Committee. And I've asked this of the author. When you wrote this amendment, disengaging from Libya, Egypt, and Pakistan, which is a nuclear-armed nation, did you ask anybody in the intelligence community, General Dave Petraeus, if there was ever an American hero in modern times as him? Have you ever asked him or Senator Chambliss or anybody else, oh, by the way, I'm thinking about pulling the plug on our aid to Pakistan, Egypt, and Libya. What's your view of that? Have you been asked that question?
Well, I thank my friend from South Carolina as well as my friend from Arizona with respect to the debate that they have been engaged in here, and for bringing this issue to the forefront and being willing to stand up and say, hey, you know, foreign aid, if you talk about that in the coffee club in Seneca, South Carolina, or Phoenix, Arizona, or Moultrie, Georgia, is not the most popular topic. And most people back home think we can balance the budget if we eliminate foreign aid, but the fact is that, as Senator Graham said, it's a fairly minuscule amount in the overall context. And right now, we're at a critical juncture in our country with respect to our fiscal house, with respect to any number of domestic and foreign policies. And as we go into the election, the American people are going to have a choice to make. But we're also at a crossroads with our foreign policy in this country. All you have to do is pick up this morning's paper, turn on the TV today, and you see what's happening in countries that are the subject of this particular amendment. There are tens of thousands of people protesting in Pakistan today. There are folks in Egypt that are still protesting. There are folks in Libya that are still protesting. We're 10 days away from the ambassador to Libya from the United States of America having been killed. We know that part of the world is in a turmoil. We know that that part of the world also has been very critical to our fight against the war, or fight in the war on terrorism. And when the President of the United States is asked a question, is Egypt an ally, and he can't answer that question affirmatively, that tells you what kind of foreign policy this